Welcome to the archive, Mark L. Gardner. Today we're going to talk about the Wild West. Very exciting subject here in America. So let's get started with you and your background in this topic.
Sure. I grew up in rural Missouri, northwest Missouri, in the heart of Jesse James country. All kinds of Jesse James lore, but also, Jesse James came out of the Civil War. The Civil War is really what made him who he was, and marked him and his brother, as well as, of course, you could say millions or thousands of other soldiers that went through that horrible conflict. So there was a rich Civil War history where I grew up. There was an outlaw history, and then my family, my dad, who was a professional logger, he cut hardwood trees like, walnuts and maples, and there in the Missouri hills. He always made sure to take off, a week to 10 days or a couple weeks and take me and my two sisters and my mom on a vacation. And they were history buffs. And so, naturally we hit like every historic fort and house and museum. So I think, not only did I grow up in a very historic area or a historic part of the country, but my parents were very interested in history and they were antique collectors. So we also, it's like, the antique part of it was a tangible thing. I mean, you're handling stuff from 100 years ago. We'd go to farm auctions and see these, bizarre and old things. And so, yeah, just very steeped in history in my upbringing and in the area I grew up in with my family.
Cool, very cool. So let's get into the next bit of why was it called the Wild West and how long, from when to when was the start point, or at least the theoretical end point of what was the Wild West?
Well, that's a debated. I mean, you could really discuss that for a long time. I'm always reminded when there's a question like this. There was a Arthur Chapman, who was a journalist in Denver in the early 1900s, and apparently there was a meeting of governors and Western governors, and they had a discussion. Where does the West really begin? And that inspired him to write a poem called "Out Where the West Begins," and he talks about where your friends and where your handshake is warmer. It was a very kind of philosophical thing more than it was a geographical place. And I think with the Wild West, and I don't even really know where that term first got coined, Wild West. But there were many West and many frontiers. I mean, Appalachia was a West. The Missouri, Missouri border area, that was a West. And then you have the High Plains, and that's another West. And what happens is that West keeps moving farther west, where it's unsettled or where you're having conflicts with the native populations that are living there. So that was happening, in Kentucky and Tennessee. Daniel Boone, he had run-ins with the native tribes there in those areas, as well as his fellow Euro-American settlers. And that is just kind of a pattern that goes on and on. For me, I guess, the Wild West, if you're talking about kind of the gunslinger outlaw era, that tends to happen right after the Civil War, where you have these cattle towns that are springing up, like Wichita, and then, of course, then Dodge City. So to me, a lot of people would associate the quote Wild West, the outlaw lawman period, Wyatt Earp, Wild Bill Hickok. That's going to start right after the Civil War, 1860s and 1870s.
It's no, it doesn't really cross my mind to think that there, what do we really define as the Wild West? Is it this gunslinger period? Is it the Western expansion? Um, I never really thought of it before like that. I just thought of it as this period where this is when we start going out west, and then this kind of when it isn't wild anymore. It's
Well, it's also, you'll hear the phrase the Old West, and usually when you hear the phrase the Old West, again you associate that with the Wild West and the railroad building era, the wagon trains, all that stuff that was going on in the 19th century. But what I like to point out to people is that those that were experiencing it, it was the New West. These boom towns, on the fringe of morality, where all kinds of things were happening. It seemed like almost anything goes. That was the New West. I mean, these towns were, people like the Earps were seeing the birth of these Western towns. They were right there at the beginning of Tombstone, for example. So they never would have thought about it as the Old West. That's something that we, in our own minds today, oh yeah, that was way back there. That was the Old West. Well, it was brand new, and it was brand new in 1880 in Tombstone. It was brand new in 1879 in Dodge City. It was brand new in Deadwood in the late 1870s. All those places, there was booming construction, and that's why they called them, boom towns, because they were just springing up because of a gold strike or a silver strike. So it was the ultimate definition on a new frontier. Was that period of the 70s and 80s in Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona.
So there's this out so very famously there's the outlaw period. And in it, at least what we see in media, we see a lot of these very like true grit type depictions where here's these middle-aged or old men riding out for one last score and they're here to do justice. When we watch the media that we produce, video games like Red Dead Redemption, um, the True Grit remake, Deadwood. I think there was a show called Godless or Lawless, um, a mini series at one point. And how accurate is this media image, the Clint Eastwood movies, the John Wayne movies? How accurate is this?
Well, I think, uh, to answer you right away, I mean, an instant answer is they're not very accurate. But, as a historian and a film buff, I don't always look at movies for accuracy. To me, Western films are another reality. It's the mythic West, and really there's no way they could be perfectly accurate. I mean, it would be impossible. I mean, a lot of these films spend a lot of time on costuming. For instance, the movie Tombstone, it incorporated actual dialogue that we know, that Doc Holliday said, Wyatt Earp, and they were able to do that because there was a hearing testimony after the OK Corral gunfight, so we know a lot of the things that were overheard or said. But I again, when I'm watching a film, if I'm paying attention to the anachronisms and the historical problems, it's it's not a very good film. But if it takes me to another place and I'm not noticing that, well, then it's ultimately great cinema. And I mean, you could point out all kinds of things that were wrong with Dances with Wolves, but it was a beautiful film and it was a very moving story, and it drew you in. And Tombstone, a lot of those films, The Searchers, one of my favorite films with John Wayne is The Searchers. It's just beautifully shot, John Ford Western. It's a very poignant story. Um, and a lot of historical inaccuracies, but it's a great movie. So, again, the top of my head answer is that no, they're not very accurate. But it's impossible really to make a truly accurate Western. So I look at them, it's just like, like they do with the comics, it's another universe, right? Where these Western films take place. And the thing is that, and there was a famous historian who said this about books by some authors, and he said they're not necessarily the literal truth, but they're an ultimate truth. So some of these films can inspire you and can bring to you an ultimate truth about the experiences between native cultures, Euro Americans, and all that. But if you're looking for something that's exactly like it was, well, there's no movie that's ever accomplished that. And some things you have to do, it's called artistic license, whether it's to move a story along or to create a mood or atmosphere. So no, I mean, but again, I don't get hung up on that. I don't get hung up on the fact is, oh man, this is really awesome. I mean, I can tell you, I mean, did you watch Kevin Costner's Horizon, the first installment?
Yes, yes.
Oh, you did. Okay. Well, this is and I love that first installment. Actually, I thought that was very. I just really it really brought me in. I got interested in the different characters, and I really want to see the second part on the big screen. But there was a part in there, and this is like very early on. There's a wagon train, and one of the things I noticed is that they used a wagon wrench to take off one of the wagon wheels. At that time, they didn't have the type of skein with a nut on the end, and that you had a wrench to unbolt it. That's a more modern thing. I could, I could have said, oh my God, they screwed up the wheel part, but it's such a minor part. I mean, they're just greasing the wheels, okay, and that was done. And that's not enough for me not to like something. And like I said, you could pick out lots. If you were really nerdy, you could pick out lots of things. But I got wrapped up in this story, and it's like that's fine. I don't really care. I like those characters. I want to know what happens to them.
Yeah. So there's a degree of acceptable inaccuracies, just,
Sure.
because it's a beautiful movie.
Yeah.
Now, the Mythic West you mentioned, was there a period during the actual Wild West that helped produce this, or was this more so a nostalgic thing when people just started to get interested in the history, or they just wanted to start making movies?
Oh, it was actually taking place at the same time that people were experiencing the West. I mean, Davy Crockett's autobiography. Davy Crockett talks about how he grinned down a bear. He grinned him till he came down. I mean, there's already these myths that are starting at the time. The West is still a lively, very new place. You could talk about the the pulp stories about Kit Carson, for example, and his daring deeds. And these stories, it wasn't just books, but it was stories that would appear in newspapers. And there's accounts of individuals who got to meet Kit Carson, and they were so disappointed because he was short. He wasn't this 6 foot tall monster of a man, with the big bare hands and bowie knives. I mean, he was very unassuming, and he did not live up to this character they had read about. So yeah, this myth building was happening right along, and it's why they became larger than life in their own lifetimes, which is really bizarre to think about. Wild Bill Hickok, he had a big write up in Harper's Monthly magazine in the late 1860s, and this duel that he had in Springfield, which actually really did happen. But again, this created these images of these Westerners, the two guns, ivory handled, and some of that was true. Wild Bill did pack two revolvers or whatever, but it was exaggerated. It was an exaggerated version of who these people were, and that's kind of why we are still fascinated by them today. I mean, these myths had been preserved, through movies and television shows. I mean, there was a popular Western series in the late '50s about Wyatt Earp, and he was this perfect hero. I mean, he did no wrong. He was a knight in shining armor, and we now know that he really wasn't that. He was a good lawman. He was fearless, but there were a lot of dark periods of his life that he just did not expose to his biographer in the late '20s. And so what we had was an incomplete version of Wyatt Earp, and that incomplete version was this pure white hat Wyatt Earp. And now we know he was just like anybody else. He had his flaws. He had dark periods of his life. He had stolen a horse once. He'd actually been a pimp at a bordello in Illinois. It fleshes him out, and to me, it makes him even that much more interesting. I mean, somebody, a Lone Ranger type is kind of boring in a way. They always are doing good. They're just too perfect. And now Wyatt is more of a human being, and he has his flaws and his foibles.
Yeah. Yeah, that is yeah, to learn about all these very human things too adds so much relatability as well to these lawmen. Yeah.
Well, for instance, Billy the Kid, the legend was he'd killed 21 men, one for each year of his life. Well, he didn't kill 21 men, but it sounded good, and this a book on his life was published within a year of his death, and it was written by mostly, well, part of it was, we believe, was written by Pat Garrett, but it was ghost written. He had a partner who really embellished things, and so yes, this myth building was taking part, and even those involved had a hand in it. I mean, Pat Garrett had a hand in publishing this book on Billy the Kid's life. So, yeah, it's fun to delve into, and there's always, when it comes to these things, there's always more to the story. Usually, if there's no more to the story, I always say history's dead. History's alive when there's controversy, and when we don't know all the answers. So that makes it more, the debate makes it much more interesting. And again, it's vibrant. If there's no debate, well, it's just kind of, we know everything there is to know. C'est la vie.
Yeah, that's why I find it so fascinating because there's so much to explore as well. Even if a period could be well documented, it could still be um, there could still be such a shroud of mystery surrounding it. Um,
Yeah, and Garrett, there's always one of the things that's important for me when I write my books is that I want to visit the physical archives. I want to see the original documents, and it seems like there's always there's always something that was overlooked, hidden, or recently donated to an institution that wasn't available to previous historians. I'll give you an example. In my latest book, I just finished, is a dual biography of Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, which will be out in November of next year. But a lot of scholars zeroed in on a police docket, a judge's docket from Dodge City from the late 70s through the early 1880s, and an author in the 1950s who published a history of Dodge City, he cited this docket book, the police court docket. But then it disappeared, and no one knew. And so, we couldn't go to it to look at it for ourselves. He just mentioned a couple of cases that involved Wyatt Earp as the arresting officer. Um, but all we had was this 1950s book, and it wasn't, just a citation, just a quote. And, there were literally hundreds of these court cases in this police court docket. Well, in the 2000s, this thing came to light in Ohio. How it got from Dodge City to Ohio, no one knows. In the process of visiting some of these institutions, archives, museums, someone will alert you to something that you should see. Now, this happened when I was researching my book, The Earth Is All That Lasts, the story of Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. And I was at an institution, and I always prepare for the visit by going online, looking at their catalog, seeing, what they have available, and I'll have a list of things I want to see. Well, this very astute archivist said, "Hey, there's something here that we got donated not too long ago that you might want to look at." And when I got it, it turns out it was papers that came from an assistant surgeon at Fort Yates, where was the head of the agency, the Standing Rock Agency was there, where Sitting Bull was. And when Sitting Bull was murdered on December 15th, 1890, his body was brought to Fort Yates, and it was taken to what they called the dead house. When somebody died, the body was taken there to be prepared for burial, what have you. Well, while his body was there, the assistant surgeon and the surgeon for the military, they removed things. I mean, they essentially stole things from his body. And a couple of things that the assistant surgeon stole. Sitting Bull had on his possession 2 cabinet cards or small photographs. They were called cabinet cards in the 19th century. And he stole those, kept them. Years later, it's donated by the family to this historical society. Well, that was in this folder that they brought to me, and they had Sitting Bull's blood stains. I mean, his blood was on these photographs. I was completely unaware of that. There are now illustrations in my book, but as a historian, that's as close as you can get to the people that you're researching. And you have a tendency sometimes that can be very abstract, but when you hold something like that in your hand with Sitting Bull's blood, it's a very moving, profound experience. And you finally realize this is a real person. This is a person who lived and breathed, who lived on this earth. And so, a historian, you really live for those moments. And I feel very fortunate to be able to to hold things like that. Whether it's, I got to hold Theodore Roosevelt's diary that he kept on San Juan Hill when I went to Harvard researching my book on the Rough Riders. I mean, how many people get to do that? He was writing, scribbling in this, the evening after the charge of the Rough Riders, and just countless things like that. It makes it really fun, and very rewarding, and that's why you visit those places, because you just can't do everything online. You can do a lot of stuff online, but not all. You've got to visit the archives, and it's really nice if you can visit the places where these things actually happened, and sometimes they're a little changed from the past. So it's a combination. Get on the ground, go to the archives, and search the newspapers that are available online.
Yeah, that's remarkable. Um, so when we that definitely reframes a lot of questions I had. Um, so when you're looking at both the locations and the artifacts and the stories that you heard, um, what are things that you find uh, that you feel with these people in this time in these places, that you feel as though going there and seeing it for yourself and experiencing it for yourself, uh, things that quite often get overlooked or should be a light should be shine on.
Well, a perfect example to visit in person is the Little Bighorn battlefield. Um, if you're just reading about Little Bighorn and you talk about a village that might have spanned, a mile in length, a half mile in length, in your mind, it's just hard to imagine that. And also, it's hard to imagine, Custer is sending messages to one of his battalion commanders, Benteen, and he's waiting for him to show up to help him. There's a whole lot of warriors that are gathering around what's left of his battalion, and when you're at the battlefield and you can look in the distance where he's expecting Benteen to come from, and it is an amazingly long distance away, and you just don't get that in your mind when you're reading about it. And I tried to present it. I do the best I can with my books, and I have a whole chapter on Little Bighorn in the Earth Is All That Lasts. But it's just not the same as standing there on Last Stand Hill, looking down into the valley where the village was, looking across the river to where Reno charged and was turned back by the warriors and fled to the top of what was later called Reno Hill. And the other thing you get by being there, in addition to just the great expanse, there's white markers where the various troopers fell. And so you can see, oh, this is where men died. And it's very poignant and very moving, and it's just in fact it's awe inspiring. It's overwhelming. I mean, you can look around and you see all these white markers, and this is where these men perished on that day, June 25th, 1876. So those emotions, they're just hard to convey in a book. They're hard to convey in a film. But if you're standing there and the wind is blowing, the buffalo grass is moving, and you're just there and you hear a whippoorwill or two, you're there with the silence, and it just tells you so much more, and you feel like you can kind of understand it, that you know it better by visiting there.
Yeah, impressive. Um, Now, talking about the people, um, not just the places, also the people. So there's a lot of glorifying that goes on with the people. You were just talking about how the Lone Ranger types
Mm.
are really bland characters to make in a movie. Um, I'm curious about people like Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp, Pat Garrett. What was it really like? Did anybody really do these showdowns where they would approach the person and they'd have their gun ready to draw and they'd go, "I'm calling you out," or
No, not really. I mean, they would usually what would happen. is that there'd be threats that were made. And it's like, next time I see you, you better have your gun or whatever. Um, and they knew that, and usually these guys were drunk. I mean, uh, and there were all kinds of reasons for these. They were really spats or feuds or whatever. Somebody got mad, or somebody didn't like the attentions you were giving to a certain saloon girl or whatever. But normally they would try to, what they call get the drop on somebody. They would try to get them by surprise and essentially murder them, shoot them, assassinate them, whatever you want to call it. They didn't really want to give them a fair fight normally. Now you can compare that to the first part of the 19th century, which I find very interesting as far as when you compare this to the early part of the 19th century. There was this practice called dueling. You've heard of the famous Alexander Hamilton duel where he is killed. Thomas Hart Benton was another famous duelist from Missouri. And, these duels were very fair and square, where you literally stood at however how many paces, and, you both fired at the same time, and it wasn't getting the drop on someone. I mean, it was a duel. It was a fair fight, so to speak, because both men are standing and facing each other. They're not trying to dodge or weave. It's a very thought to be a very honorable way of settling disputes. But in the Wild West or Old West, they really weren't duels. The only example that it's even close was that Wild Bill Hickok incident in Springfield. And he fought, these two guys were like 75 yards apart, which is a great distance for revolvers. And Wild Bill killed his opponent. They'd had an argument before. But normally they're trying to, they've got an axe to grind, or they've got a grudge against someone. And so they're going to shoot him in the back, or they're going to surprise him. John Wesley Hardin, famous gunfighter, shot in the back of the head. Ben Thompson and King Fisher, those guys are ambushed in a theater in Texas. These guys didn't want to give them a chance to kill them. Jesse James shot in the back of the head. Billy the Kid shot in the dark. Pat Garrett said that Billy the Kid had threatened to kill him, and he wasn't going to give him a chance. And one of the reasons for his book that I mentioned earlier, he wanted to set the record straight. And he said, people accuse me of hiding behind a couch and blah, blah, blah. He says, let me tell you, if there'd been a couch, I would have been hiding behind it. He admitted, it's like, I wasn't going to give this crazy killer a chance to shoot me. He'd already threatened me, and he'd already killed, a county sheriff. And so Pat Garrett was not going to give him a chance. So the only kind of these gunfights that you're referring to are very rare. But one good example is actually the gunfight at the OK Corral. Literally kind of within seconds of when the Earps and Doc Holliday encounter the McClarys and Clantons, each side is pulling guns and firing. The only thing that, and I think this really intrigued me about that gunfight. In all the movies, they've got these fancy gun rigs, leather holsters and stuff. Well, Wyatt Earp had his revolver in a coat pocket. He wasn't pulling it from a holster. And actually, at the time, tailors would sew in gun pockets into trousers and into pockets of coats and line them so that they wouldn't get hung up as you're pulling them out of your clothing. So not everybody wore a fancy leather gun rig. They were out there. Cowboys, wore gun rigs and holsters and all that. But at that gunfight, Doc Holliday was pulling his revolver out of a pocket, and so was Wyatt Earp.
Yeah. Okay, that's a really interesting thought, that people were pulling their guns out of their coat pockets and not didn't have this gun holster. They didn't
Yeah,
flash it open. They didn't flash their coat
exactly.
open, their duster
Yeah,
open.
yeah. You
Draw!
see the movie.
Pull out the
You see the
gun.
movie. They tuck that coat behind them, and they see the you see the gun and the holster and everything. And probably those coats were they were probably oversized pockets to because a Colt Peacemaker, or what was technically it's called a single action army revolver, it had a 7.5-inch barrel. So that's not you'd want a big pocket to carry that in, and you wouldn't want it getting hung up as you're pulling it out either. But yeah, and I thought that was, to me, that was one of the things I just did not realize when I researched the gunfight and then wrote about it was I just assumed that all these guys had gun leather and holsters, and that's just the way it was, but it wasn't.
Yeah. So were these obviously like there was a lot of outlaws that were pretty bad people. Um, there were some guys that sounded like they enjoyed killing. There's some people that just seemed like they were conditioned. There's some people that would just kill anybody that would get in their way, and there are some people that seemed as though they would kill only out of necessity or self-defense while they were doing whatever criminal activity. Um, just how bad did it really get with
As far as
outlaws and with the lawmen?
well, I you could certainly say there were psychopaths, in the Wild West. I mean, there were true killers. John Wesley Hardin, according to some accounts, I mean, he might have killed in excess of 20 men. We don't know if that's all documented, but certainly there were certain personalities that did not hesitate to kill and that had no remorse. Some of these individuals come out of a very violent civil war. I mean, I always think of Jesse James and Frank James. They rode with the bushwhackers under Quantrell and Bloody Bill Anderson. Bloody Bill, that was a real. He deserved that moniker, Bloody Bill. I mean, he had Union scalps from his saddle, from his horse's bridle, and Jesse James rode under him. Quantrill committed with his men the Lawrence Massacre, where maybe as many as 150 men and boys, mostly civilians, were murdered in the streets of Lawrence. Uh, you know, Killing just when you see that as a teenager, and Jesse James was a teenager when he rode with Quantrell and Bloody Bill. Um, that has to have an effect on you, and um, you know whether you want to call it PTSD, or just becoming numb to the violence and the death because you just see it every day and you experience loss. You see your buddies killed as well. Jesse James and Frank were also involved in the Centralia massacre in 1864. And, Bloody Bill rode into the town of Centralia. Unfortunately, a train arrived that had, more than a dozen men or so that were on furlough, Union troops, and they murdered them, on the siding and took their clothes. At first, they made them strip because they want clothes to get bloody because they wore those clothes from the Union side. They murdered them, and then when troops came to attack Bloody Bill later, where their camp was, they massacred them and killed more than 120 of those guys and just slaughtered them. They didn't take prisoners. Frank tried to explain, and I don't want to get too sidetracked, Garrett, but Frank James said we couldn't take around prisoners. We just couldn't do it. I mean, we didn't have the capability of, so what was the option? You either turn them loose or you kill them, and they killed them. And here's an interesting comparison. I recently watched an interview about the Band of Brothers in World War II. Those guys did the same thing. There was one officer who admitted later they took some German prisoners and they killed them and the officer said we had no way we couldn't take them along. We didn't have a jail to put them in, and the easiest thing for them to do was to kill them. So it wasn't just Bloody Bill that did that or the bushwhackers. That happened decades later as well. So again, my point is when you experience and see that kind of violence, I just don't think it becomes that hard to kill somebody that's a threat. Um, you know, when the banker in Northfield, Minnesota, the cashier said the place was the safe's on a time lock and refused to open it, Frank James murders him later. It's like, we told you, we warned you, and either you can open up or you can die. And so Frank murdered him right there. Anyway, yeah, I now you might have a difference, between a true psychopath and someone that's just numb to the killing itself. Another example. Did you ever read the book American Sniper by Chris Kyle?
I read parts of it.
Okay. Well, there was a passage that really struck me and reminded me of the Bushwhackers and Jesse James and Frank James. But Chris Kyle talked about how him and a buddy, they were on a rooftop, and I guess they spotted an enemy soldier on a motorcycle who was involved in some kind of incident, and he had permission to kill him, and he did. The shot hit him as the motorcyclist was driving away, and Chris Kyle talked about how him and his buddy, they laughed at the way the guy fell off the motorcycle dead. That tells you how callous and what war does to somebody. He killed a human being, but the way the guy died was funny, and they'd become completely numb to killing and death, and that's the way I look at Jesse and Frank and the Bushwhackers. Now that didn't make Chris Kyle a psychopath. He was in war, but he had become numb, to this death, to this killing or whatever. And I think in a way, Frank and Jesse were that way too.
Yeah. And aside from the violence, was this also a period where you saw a lot of death? If I were to go back in time?
Well, it depends on where you lived. So if you lived in Tombstone, Arizona, in 1880 and 1881, it seemed like there was a lot of violence. And, there was a guy that kept a diary. His name was George W. Parsons. It's been published. And he writes about these stupid, fights and spats. And, there's one that just strikes me as so bizarre. Um, but this individual, he bought a new shirt, and people were making fun of his shirt. And the more he drank, the more belligerent he became. And he said, the next person that says something about my shirt, I'm going to knock him down. Well, a buddy of his comes in and happens to know, oh, you got a new shirt. Well, he knocked him down and bloodied him. And so the buddy went away and got a gun. And he came back and he says, why did you do that? And the guy with the new shirt said, because you deserved it. And he hit him again. Well, this time the guy drew his gun and killed him, over his shirt. He killed this guy in a fight over a new shirt. So that's the kind of stuff that could happen in certain areas. Other places in the West, other than, boom towns would bring in a certain element, gamblers, boom towns like Dodge City brought in cowboys that they were getting paid off at the end of the drive. So they're getting drunk, they're spending their money on women, and they can become belligerent. And in fact, some of the violence that occurred was when lawmen were disarming these drunken cowboys. Wichita and Dodge City and Tombstone, which wasn't a cow town, they had laws against carrying weapons, whether open or concealed. And so it was the lawman's job to disarm, and take to jail, and there would be a fine, if they got caught with a weapon. And some scholars, I can remember, and I can't remember exactly which one, but they wrote that, well, when you actually look at the number of killings and murders in places like Dodge City, it wasn't much different than major cities in the East. Well, there's a reason for that, because you had excellent lawmen like Wyatt Earp who became very adept at disarming these guys. That's why those town commissioners, councilmen wanted people like Wyatt Earp and the Mastersons employed as lawmen, because they didn't want a bunch of violence. They didn't want guns going off, because sometimes innocent people got struck by these bullets. At the gunfight at the OK Corral, there were school children, nearby, on the streets. A stray bullet could have killed somebody. And in fact, some innocent people, there's one guy that had a bullet hole through his pants trousers. He not involved whatsoever. So townspeople didn't want this violence, and they tried to hire people, even if they weren't, the purest of individuals. They tried to hire people that could corral these cowboys. If they had to hit them over the head with a gun barrel to settle them down or whatever, they would. Yeah, I mean, if there wasn't a whole lot of murders or gun violence, you can ascribe that to the good lawmen that were policing those communities.
Yeah, definitely a rough place, rough job. Now you talk
Well,
about cowboys.
Bat Masterson's brother Garrett was killed disarming a cowboy. I mean, it could cost you your. I mean, it was not an easy thing. I mean, it was dangerous. Today, today, if you see those videos where there's an armed suspect, man, they don't give them a chance. It doesn't seem like. I mean, if you start to wave your gun, they kill them. So it's amazing to me that somebody like Wyatt Earp would go up to an armed man and wrestle with him or knock him out to grab the gun. That doesn't happen at all. That is not part of police work today. You're not going to get close to an armed suspect because you could get killed, and lawmen did in the 19th century.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty wild the level of skill these guys had.
And
So
and Garrett bravery.
yeah,
Wyatt was considered one of the most fearless men, and Bat Masterson, who was a good friend of his, said he'd never met a braver, more, who just had no fear whatsoever. Um, and that was a very rare quality, to be able to keep your nerves and have no fear. Pat Garrett said a similar thing about Billy the Kid. He said it wasn't that Billy the Kid was a very good shot, it was that he kept his cool in very anxious moments. He didn't lose his cool, and that made him deadly. Whereas others, they would panic and fire wildly or whatever. So keeping your cool, bravery was a very important part of a survivor's personality. And Wyatt Earp was certainly a very long time survivor.
yeah, yeah, definitely. Brave and survivor. Um, so you mentioned cowboys and you mentioned lawmen separately, and cowboys, when people say cowboy films, the immediate idea that comes up is lawmen, outlaws. So what separated cowboys from the rest of the bunch?
Rest of the bunch in what way? What do you mean the? Um,
What did they do that was different from either a lawman or an outlaw?
Well, the Cowboys themselves, I mean, they're basically drovers. I mean, they're driving, well, in the period of Wichita and Dodge City, they're driving herds from Texas north to these railheads where the beef can be shipped east for whatever markets that they're going to. And most cowboys were not violent individuals. A lot of them did carry weapons because, you might encounter a situation where you needed a revolver. It might be something as simple as shooting a rattlesnake or some varmint or whatever. Um, but but they weren't necessarily, and usually weren't, violent people. They were simply, they were buckaroos. They drove. You might have some cowboys that their specialty was breaking horses, taking wild horses and taming them to ride with the saddle. They're herders, drovers. Um, Now, as I mentioned earlier, when they got to their destination and they delivered the herds, that's when they were paid off and they had all this money to spend. And so boom towns like Wichita, like Dodge City, like Ellsworth, Kansas, these are all Kansas cow towns. They thrived off of this money from the herds because the Cowboys weren't just spending money on booze and women. They might buy a saddle or some fancy boots or some roping cuffs or a brand new shirt. So there were all these kind of businesses that were taking advantage of these well-off cowboys once they got to their destination. And of course, there was also gambling. So the saloons always had, card games, whether it was Monte or Faro or poker, and there would be gamblers. In fact, the gamblers and prostitutes had kind of a regular circuit. And during the summer months when the herds were being driven north, well, they would go to these cow towns like Wichita or Dodge City. And then during the winter months, they'd migrate back to larger cities like Kansas City or St. Louis to tide them over until, again, the Cowboys would be heading north to Dodge City. And then also, they would visit, the big mining boom towns. When Tombstone springs up, one of the reasons Wyatt is going to Tombstone, he's become a professional gambler at this point, and he does ride shotgun for Wells Fargo, but he also, one of his intentions is to make money gambling, and eventually he has a partner in a gambling establishment in the Oriental Saloon in Tombstone. And Doc Holliday, even though he was trained as a dentist, he pretty much gave up on the dentistry. And by the time he arrives in Tombstone, it's purely he's gambling. He's a dealer. That's all he's doing. He has no intentions of doing dentistry ever again. I always thought that Doc Holliday. Well, I think it became an addiction for him. He had tuberculosis, so he could be a heavy drinker at times, and there's some theories that he was self-medicating with the drinking because of his illness. But he could not stop gambling. I mean, for the rest of his days, he was always gambling, whether he was dealing or gambling personally. And so some of these gamblers, you know, the best place to be if you want to be a gambler is you go to where the money is. And so you're making money off the money that's off the silver or the gold that's coming out of the ground. So that's either Deadwood or Tombstone. Could be Butte, Montana. Doc Holliday went up there for a while and it was booming. Yeah, there's a whole industry making money off the people that are bringing it out of the ground. The miners that are getting paid and the mine owners themselves.
Yeah. Okay. Um, Now, the gold rush was really what kind of kicked off the whole Wild West, the whole Western expansion, the way that we saw it today. Um, so when that kicked off and everybody's going out west, did anybody really strike gold or really strike it big mining? Or was it that there were a lot of businesses and cities that grew up and industry made that was where people actually made their money. People actually made their gold, sort of say.
Yeah, very few struck it rich. I mean, there was enough people striking rich to entice this horde of people to go to migrate west. Um, but most of I think, uh, more people struck it rich making money off of the miners themselves, whether it's selling outfitting supplies in places like St. Joseph, Missouri, for instance. Um, you know, uh, there were wagon makers who made fortunes making wagons for immigrants going over the Oregon and California Trail. In St. Louis, one of the big wagon makers was a man named Joseph Murphy, and his wagons were famous as being very well made and being able to withstand the journey over the plains where you're dealing with the dry air and the heat where your wood is shrinking. And his wagons were known for being well seasoned. Now that wasn't always the case, because sometimes when you have to crank out the wagons, you can't always get the best dried wood. You're gonna use green wood as well. But anyway, yeah, I mean, you can make a good living as just a wagon maker in Missouri, supplying these immigrants, whether they're gold seekers or people going to Oregon and California to settle down and take their families. In places like San Francisco, merchants are making money hand over fist. Supplying again. They're outfitting, getting supplies that are being sent to the gold camps, and then in the gold camps themselves, there's merchants that are setting up. I mean, if you were smart, you really didn't have to dig or use a wash pan. You could sell stuff at inflated prices, to the miners. In Tombstone, I mean, a sack of flour that would cost, maybe $2 in Kansas could be 3 or 4 times that in Tombstone. Part of it was the fact you had to, there's the cost of transportation, but also everything was more expensive in Tombstone. But also the laborers, a good carpenter, a blacksmith, they got paid more in Tombstone than they did in Kansas, for instance, because there was a huge demand for their work, and there weren't enough of these laborers, craftsmen, I should say, to satisfy this need. So, yeah, you could get paid more as a craftsman, but then you're also going to pay more for lodging and for your food. So maybe it kind of offsets somewhat. But no, I think it's always there's a risk involved in goal seeking. Some do strike it rich, and again, that fuels the imaginations and others. Um, but a more sure thing, if you're smart and if you have the means, is to be a merchant and sell to those miners and sell food supplies, outfitting goods, what have you.
Yeah. Um, Quickly, what would everyday life kind of been like for somebody traveling out west and starting up a new life in one of these towns?
Well, the journey itself, I mean, it's 10 or 12 miles a day. So it's going to take you a while to get to where you're going. And those journeys weren't always a sure thing. one famous example, the Donner Party, didn't go well for them on their trip to California. Um, but I mean, everyday life, once you got to places, once you got to your destination, I don't think it was really much different, other than, uh, you know, those places where they're first breaking the sod, let's say, the Kansas plains or whatever. And we see this in the historical record that, in fact, you can even go online and you'll see photographs of some of these sod busters and first year's crop. I mean, there's like corn that's way over that's like, oh man, look how fabulous and lush it is. And well, then, there were good years and maybe they happened to break the sod in a wet year and things were great. Well, then maybe 2 years later, it wasn't that great. There was a drought or what have you. So I guess it was kind of mixed, the experience. You can look at families like the Ingalls of Laura Ingalls Wilder. It seemed like they were frequently moving around to different places. Was that because the pasture was greener? Was that because they went bust at the place that they were? A lot of times you racked up a debt and you couldn't pay it off, and all of a sudden, in the middle of the night, this family's gone. Well, they moved someplace else, and then they tried to start again. That was the case with the Earps. Wyatt Earp's father. He went deep into debt and was in Lamar, Missouri, and rather than pay his debts, he left. And he ends up in California, and they end up selling his house for taxes there in Lamar. So some of these families was a process of starting over and over and over. It wasn't just once. Sometimes you started over 2 or 3 times. But as far as everyday life, I mean, I think they all experienced, the same things, depending on, where you lived, and it may not be that much different than someone that's farming in Missouri. If you're trying to, farm in Oregon or whatever, you're still going to have to go out there with your team of mules or horses, and you're probably not rich, and so it's just going to be you, and maybe you got a son that can help you. Kind of a similar type experience. As far as if you're a gambler, of course, you're not doing any physical your labor. You're just trying to make money, steal money, basically, from people at the gambling table.
Yeah. All right. So just want to give you a moment before we wrap this all up. Is there any history you feel, anything in the Wild West you want to take a moment to talk about? A quick story or anything?
Oh, well, I mean, I could certainly recommend, some books that are, really good to kind of, get an introduction to various different periods of the West. You know, one of the uh, one of the great books about the Southwest during the U.S.-Mexican War is called Watoya and the Taos Trail by Louis Girard, and was published in 1850. And Lewis was a very young man, went down the Santa Fe Trails, a wagon train, went to Bent's Fort. He happened to be down there when the U.S. Mexican War broke out. So he has all kinds of interesting details and experiences. And then to stick with the Santa Fe Trail, another really good book is called Land of Enchantment by Marion Sloan Russell. And as a little girl, she went down the Santa Fe Trail and lived at Fort Union for a while in Santa Fe, and she got to know Kit Carson, who became very fond of her, and her recollections are really worthwhile. And then as far as life on the cattle trail and in the cow camp, there was an author named Andy Adams, and he wrote a book called Log of a Cowboy. Now it's fiction, but it's based on his own experiences on the cattle drives going up from Texas. And really, there's just I could go on and on about books of Western Americana that are worthwhile. There's biographies of Wyatt Earp and of course Billy the Kid and Doc Holliday. They're all out there, and those can be looked up, and those are worthwhile if you're interested in a particular character or whatever. But that's what's nice about books. And then as far as films that to me that capture again kind of the essence of some of these Western experiences. I've got to say, my favorite Jesse James movie is the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, and it stars Brad Pitt as Jesse James. And that film, it was made in Canada, so it looks nothing like Missouri where I grew up. But I just thought it captured Jesse much better than any other film, and also Robert Ford. In fact, the author of the novel that's based on, Ron Hansen, I said, man, I said that's. I told him once, I said that's the best Jesse James movie ever. He says, Mark, I like to think of it's the best Bob Ford movie, because that's really kind of the focus of his book is Bob Ford. Um, so that's a great film, to kind of introduce you to Jesse James. And another one that's an earlier period, which is one of my favorites, is called Ride with the Devil, which is directed by Ang Lee. That came out in the late '90s, and it's about the Bushwhackers. And it stars Tobey Maguire before he was Spider-Man, and also a young singer named Jewel is in it. But I mean, it's very accurate as far as what these bushwhackers were like and the fighting that was going on in Missouri at that time. So anyway, there's a couple films to check out and a few books that people can look at, and they can also my dual biography of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse is called The Earth Is All That Lasts. That's my most recent book. And then I did a dual biography of Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday called Brothers of the Gun, and that comes out in November of 2025.
Awesome. All right. Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you, Garrett.